Okay, our next podcast is going to go into looking at the diversity within the plant kingdom. In this, we can start by looking at the major characteristics that would be associated with all plants, and then we're going to look at the major groups that plants are divided into. Now, all plants are photosynthetic. That's a characteristic of all plants. And unlike the multicellular algae that we looked at that belongs in the Proteus group, these plants have vascular tissue and true leaves, stems, and roots. And we'll look at that. Um, so a couple of major traits that appear in all plants is that they exhibit what's called alternation of generation. Alternation of generation is where the plant will alternate basically between two haploid and diploid generations. And so in this, it will have a haploid plant called the gametophyte, and then it through mitosis will produce cells that will develop into diploid cells that will be the sporophyte. All right, and so some plants spend most of their life in the gametophyte state, and some spend most of their life in the sporophyte. So there is variation within the plant kingdom, but that is that all plants exhibit some form of alternation of generation. Another thing that is characteristic of all plants is that they exhibit or they have walled spores that produce sporangia. And so in this you can see the gametophyte and sporophyte stages of this plant in the same plant. The sporophyte is on the top portion, and the bottom portion here is the gametophyte. So in this particular plant, it has both. It's a moss, and it has both the gametophyte and then the sporophyte growing off of it. And then at the top of the sporophyte is where the sporangium is, and that is where spores are produced. Spores are the haploid generation that will be released from the plant. And so those are produced here, and that is a characteristic of plants. Another characteristic of plants is the male and female structures that the plant has. Gametangia is the name of these structures, and these gametangia, there is the female structures that produce eggs. Those are called archegonium. And then there is the male structures that produce sperm, and those are called antheridium. And so the antheridia and archegonia are the male and female structures of the plant, and those are called the gametangia. And the last example of something that is consistent in all plants is that they have apical meristems. Apical meristems is the point at which the plant grows, basically. It is new growth tissue where mitosis is taking place to increase the length of the stem and the root. So the apical you could think of being like the apex, the tip of the stem and the tip of the root. Right here, mitosis is taking place and new cells are being added to increase the length of the root and stem. Now, there are some plants that also increase in width, but that is not all plants. But all plants increase in length at the stem and root. So that's a characteristic of all plants. Okay, so the next thing we want to look at is beginning to look at the major groups of plants. And we can divide these up into different divisions. And the first division we're going to look at is the division Bryophyta. Bryophytes include mainly the mosses are bryophytes. There's a few others, liverworts, um, and but mainly the mosses. And some of the unique things about these um, plants are that these are non-vascular plants. So vascular tissue is tissue that the plant uses to transport water and nutrients around. But these plants do not have that vascular tissue. So this is the bryophytes. Um, Well, before looking at the bryophytes in any detail, we'll look at the major groups of plants that we're going to look at. So the divisions include the bryophytes right here, which are non-vascular, and they include the mosses, liverworts, and another small group called the hornworts. And then we'll look at the vascular plants. So the rest of the plants all have vascular tissue. Some do not produce seeds. So these include the ferns and a few other groups are in there as well. And then we have the seed plants. These are plants that produce seeds, and there's two major groups of that, gymnosperms and angiosperms. So we're going to look at all of these, but as I mentioned, we're going to start with the bryophytes. Mosses and liverworts and hornworts are the other two groups. Now, in the bryophytes, we can say that all of the bryophytes have large gametophytes, and then and the sporophytes are a smaller and a shorter portion of their life cycle. And we can look at a life cycle of one here. We'll start. So the mosses are a good example. We can begin with this one here. So the mosses, like all plants, release spores. So spores are produced from the sporophyte. Here's a sporophyte. So all mosses have a green leafy portion that you would recognize as the moss. And those are called the gametophytes. But they also, at the tip of the gametophytes, at certain times, they will produce sporophytes. And these sporophytes are where the spores are produced. Meiosis occurs in the capsule of the sporophyte, and spores are produced up there. Those spores are released. They can grow when they begin. They're haploid. Meiosis produces haploid cells, and these are haploid spores. And but once they germinate and start growing, they can grow into new gametophytes. And these gametophytes can grow. There can be both a male and a female gametophyte. And so as they grow, we can look at the next part. Up at the top, the male ones, the male gametophytes are going to have the antheridia. So again, the antheridia produce sperm, and the archegonia produce eggs. Archegonia are found at the very tip of a female gametophyte, and so the eggs are produced there. Now the sperm is released from the archegonia, so the sperm is motile, eggs are stationary, but this sperm has to get to the egg in water. So the sperm can't be transferred through the air, doesn't move through the air or carried by insects or anything like that. It has to move through water. So in order for that to occur, these mosses are generally found in damp, wet locations so that water can transfer these sperm to the egg where fertilization can take place. All right, so sperm and egg unite there, and then inside the archegonia, it begins to grow. That new zygote will begin to grow. Oh, sorry. Will begin to grow, and out of it, the embryo grows into a sporophyte. Here's a young sporophyte, and then a new one will begin to grow there. So this is the life cycle, a general life cycle of a moss, which is very common for the bryophytes. Archegonia, antheridia are present, confined to moist areas. So that's very common characteristic is that they are confined to moist area. Okay, so well, let's look at some examples. So here's some moss. The green leafy portion in the back is the gametophytes. Here is a sporophyte that has been produced, getting ready to release spores there. So that's an example of sporophyte and gametophyte. Okay, so the next we're going to look at is a plant that does have vascular tissue, and it has vascular tissue, but it does not produce seeds. All right, so this group includes the seedless vascular plant group, includes the ferns. So the ferns, some other things, club mosses, horsetails are also found in this group as well. But they do have vascular tissue. So let's look at some examples. So here's some right here. This is a type of seedless vascular plant, a spike moss. So it's not actually a moss, it's a form of a fern. Here's a quillwort. And again, this is a type of lycophyte here. And so we have here a club moss. Here's a club moss. So that's it's not a moss in the bryophytes. It is actually in the seedless vascular plant group. Here's some other, the ferns are the pterophytes, and so here's some examples of different types of ferns, and we'll look at a life cycle to see the life cycle. Let's look at the life cycle of the fern here. All right, so similar to the moss is the fern life cycle. It has sporangia. The sporangia are located underneath the leaves or fronds of the fern, are little structures called sori, or sorus singular. And that is the site where the spores are produced. So the spores are produced and released, again, through meiosis, and they are released. They can grow into a young gametophyte. Now, this gametophyte, it has both male and female reproductive structures on the same individual. All right, and so the female structures are right here in the notch, and those are called the archegonia. Same terms are used for these, and the antheridia are down here along the rhizoids, the structures here. And so again, in this plant, the sperm has to travel through water. So this is another major characteristic of the seedless vascular plant. So it does not produce seeds that are able to transfer other ways. So this is similar to the bryophytes in that fashion, that the sperm has to be transferred through water. So again, you would find these generally in damp locations where water can transfer the sperm to the egg. If reproduction is going to continue to occur. And once it does, it grows off of this. So the gametophyte here is just a short part of the life cycle. That's not what we generally recognize as the fern. What we recognize as the fern is the sporophyte that grows out of the fusion of the sperm and egg. So that's the sporophyte. So sporophyte can be the dominant generation or the gametophyte in plants. Okay, so we're going to end the podcast there. We've covered two groups of plants. We still have some major groups. We got the seed plants left to cover. They're the most diverse group of plants. And so we'll pick that up in our next lecture.